June 1944. Central Pacific. A moonless night stretched endlessly over the Philippine Sea, its surface a black mirror broken only by the faint white scars of a submarine's wake. Beneath that still water, 60 meters down, the crew of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-37 moved in silence, their diesel engines long since shut down. The only sound was the soft, mechanical heartbeat of the boat's hydrophones, faint pings rolling through the hull like distant thunder. For years, the ocean had been Japan's ally, a vast shield of distance and darkness. Here, in the deep, the Empire's submarines had stalked the sea lanes unchallenged. But now, even the abyss no longer felt safe. Each man on board sensed it. The ocean had changed. Petty Officer Yoshikazu Endo adjusted the hydrophone dial, trying to isolate a sound rising through the black water. It wasn't a ship's screw or a destroyer's propeller. It was something alien, a rapid, pulsing tone that shifted in pitch before vanishing. Moments later, it returned, repeating at perfect intervals. To the men trained to recognize every rhythm of the sea, it was unnatural, mechanical, and somehow deliberate. "Could be a new type of American mine," the navigator whispered. Others thought it was a trick of the current, a distortion of sonar. Yet within hours, similar reports surfaced across the Imperial fleet. Strange cylindrical buoys floating on the surface, releasing timed pings, marking something beneath the waves. By dawn, aircraft had been spotted circling above them. Twin-engined patrol bombers, dropping small objects into the sea that sank just below the surface and began transmitting. The ocean, once infinite, now felt mapped, numbered, and watched. In the control room of I-37, Captain Shoji Kashiwabara studied his navigation charts. The water around him, once a refuge, had become a trap. He ordered the submarine to dive deeper, but the eerie pulses followed, echoing faintly even 100 meters down. Each ping seemed to find them. No one aboard could explain it. The Americans had begun using the sea itself as a weapon. By mid-1944, Imperial submarine commanders were filing confused reports, sightings of floating microphones that appeared harmless. Yet days later, those same patrol areas were saturated with depth charges. It was as if invisible lines had been drawn across the Pacific, marking the presence of every submarine that dared to move. The devices would later be identified as sonobuoys, the first generation of airborne acoustic sensors deployed by U.S. Navy patrol aircraft. Dropped in chains from the sky, each buoy transmitted the faintest underwater sound to aircraft orbiting above, creating a network of ears across thousands of kilometers of ocean. To the Japanese crews who first heard them, they were omens, mechanical ghosts that stripped the ocean of secrecy. What had once been the silent domain of hunters had become a killing ground controlled by sound. And as the I-class submarines vanished, one after another, a single truth became undeniable. The Pacific no longer belonged to men who fought beneath it. The Imperial Navy's hunters had become the hunted, and soon they would learn how the Americans had turned the ocean itself into a machine. 2 years before Japanese submariners first heard the strange pulses in the Pacific, engineers at Bell Telephone Laboratories had already begun designing a weapon that would transform anti-submarine warfare. The project carried a sterile designation, ANCRT-1, yet its implications were revolutionary. It would allow aircraft to hear beneath the sea. The concept had emerged in 1941 when the U.S. Navy faced an impossible problem. Submarines could hide anywhere. Radar saw only the surface. Sonar required contact through the water. Aircraft, moving too fast and flying too high, could not detect what lay below. The solution came not from admirals, but from physicists and radio engineers. If aircraft could not listen directly, perhaps they could deploy something that would... a floating hydrophone, small enough to drop from a plane, sensitive enough to capture the signature hum of a submarine's propellers, and smart enough to radio that sound back through the air. The earliest prototypes were crude cylinders of steel and bakelite, barely a meter long, each carrying a single vacuum tube amplifier, a hydrophone element, and a short-range radio transmitter operating around 300 kilocycles. But in laboratory tanks at Bell Labs, they worked. When submerged, the hydrophone converted pressure waves into electric signals, amplified them, and broadcast them back to a receiver tuned in the aircraft above. In 1942, the Navy Bureau of Ordnance authorized production under Western Electric. Within a year, thousands of the new sonobuoys were rolling off assembly lines. Each weighed about 20 kilograms, had a listening depth of roughly 30 meters, and a battery life of 4 hours. Dropped by parachute, it floated upright, half-submerged, its antenna protruding just above the surface. The effect was immediate and startling. A single aircraft could scatter a dozen buoys across a search grid, creating a temporary acoustic net over a patch of ocean nearly 10 square kilometers wide. When a submarine's propellers turned within range, their sound registered as spikes on an oscilloscope or a pattern of tones in the operator's headphones. It was a primitive system by later standards, but in 1943 it was revolutionary. For the first time, sound could be weaponized from the sky. The new device fit perfectly into the Navy's evolving hunter-killer doctrine. Long-range patrol aircraft, the PBY Catalina, the PV-1 Ventura, and later the B-24-based PB-4Y2 Privateer, began carrying racks of the small cylinders alongside depth charges. A typical patrol pattern involved radar detection of a surface contact, followed by a sonobuoy drop when the target submerged. The buoys relayed the submarine's movement directly to the aircraft, guiding it for attack runs even without visual contact. In training manuals, American crews were instructed to imagine themselves as ears in the air. Lieutenant Commander William L. Higginbotham, one of the first aviators to use the system, described the eerie precision of the new technology. You could hear them breathe down there. The propellers, the hydraulic pumps, every heartbeat of the enemy was suddenly audible. The device's internal hydrophone could detect low-frequency sounds up to 8 kilometers away. Its radio transmitter, powered by a small dry-cell battery, could send those signals several miles through the atmosphere. A single aircraft monitoring multiple frequencies could triangulate the submarine's path in real time, a feat that surface ships with traditional sonar arrays could never achieve. In the Pacific, this new sensory weapon arrived just as the balance of power was shifting. By 1944, American industry was producing 3,000 sonobuoys per month, enough to equip every patrol squadron from the Aleutians to the Coral Sea. Each buoy cost less than $25, cheaper than a single depth charge. Meanwhile, Japan's hydrophone technology lagged nearly a decade behind. Most Imperial submarines still used passive sound detection arrays designed in the late 1930s, directional microphones fixed to the hull, dependent on human interpretation, and nearly useless above 10 knots. In comparison, the American system could map an entire soundscape within seconds. The technical disparity mirrored the larger industrial divide. The United States had converted its commercial radio industry into a wartime machine. Bell Labs supplied designs, Western Electric built transmitters, RCA produced vacuum tubes, and aircraft manufacturers developed standardized release racks that allowed pilots to drop the buoys in perfect geometric grids. Every component was interchangeable. Every part was mass-produced. By mid-1944, American engineers had refined the sonobuoy into a family of devices. One model optimized for deep listening, another for shallow coastal waters, and a third designed to activate only after contact with seawater, conserving its 4-hour battery until deployment. When combined with radar, magnetic anomaly detectors, and coordinated communications between aircraft and destroyers, the sonobuoy became a crucial link in a vast detection network, an invisible net spreading across the Pacific. To the air crews who used them, these devices were tools. To the men beneath the waves, they were an omen of an enemy that could now see through darkness and water alike. It would not take long for the Japanese to discover these mysterious cylinders firsthand. Strange metallic objects floating in their patrol zones, silently listening and sending the sea's secrets to the sky. Their first impulse was curiosity. Their second was fear, and soon they would try to capture one. Late August 1944, Central Pacific. The submarine I-8, operating east of the Mariana Islands, surfaced after sunset to recharge batteries. The night air was warm, the sky clear. Crewmen stepped onto the deck for brief moments of relief, eyes straining for aircraft silhouettes that never came. Then one of them spotted something strange in the water, a small gray cylinder bobbing gently in the swell, trailing thin wire, and a stub antenna glinting in the moonlight. At first they thought it a fuel drum or marker buoy, but it was too small, too precise, too deliberate. The object floated upright, never fully rolling with the waves. Captain Tatsunosuke Arizumi ordered a boat lowered. Under flickering deck lamps, sailors hauled the device aboard, careful not to trigger any possible mechanism. Its smooth metal casing bore stenciled letters, ANCRT-1A. The characters meant nothing to them, but the sight of the American code alone sent a chill through the crew. The Japanese Navy had recovered countless fragments of Allied equipment, bombs, radio sets, gun mounts, yet this object radiated a different kind of mystery. They laid it on deck like a captured creature from another world. The casing was sealed with rubber gaskets. From its base hung a cluster of small fins, and at the top, an antenna no longer than a hand. When a petty officer tapped the casing, it echoed hollow, metallic, unnervingly light. Could it be a mine? Someone whispered. Another sailor suggested it might be an underwater radio beacon, guiding Allied convoys. Arizumi ordered the object taken below for study. What they found confounded even the engineers. Inside the watertight housing lay a compact assembly of wires, coils, and glass tubes, vacuum tubes, each labeled with English markings and serial numbers. There was a battery pack, a circuit board lacquered to resist salt water, and a slender microphone-shaped sensor embedded in wax at the base. It was far beyond the simplicity of Japanese naval electronics. Lieutenant Hiroshi Morita, the boat's sound officer, examined it under a red lamp, sketching the components in his notebook. It listens, he concluded, and it speaks. The crew fell silent. The next day, the I-8 radioed a coded message to the Kure Naval Technical Department reporting the recovery of an American acoustic cylinder believed used for undersea surveillance. Within weeks, similar reports arrived from submarines I-37 and I-44, each describing floating devices found in patrol zones, later attacked by Allied aircraft. The pattern was unmistakable. The Americans had filled the ocean with listening machines. After the war, Japanese archives would reveal at least 6 document recoveries between August and November 1944. In each case, crews described nearly identical objects, light metal tubes, sealed, containing small batteries and radio transmitters. Most assumed them to be part of a mine detection system or air-sea navigation aid. Only later would engineers realize what they had truly captured. The first operational sonobuoys ever deployed in large numbers. An entry from the log of submarine I-44, preserved in the National Institute for Defense Studies, Tokyo, reads with restrained confusion. Object recovered on surface at 144 D32E, 14 to 11N. Device emits periodic tones underwater, ceasing when exposed to air. Believed to be an American listening mine, recommends study under controlled condition. Another diary fragment from Petty Officer Koji Matsuda captures the emotional impact rather than the technical. It was like finding the ocean itself whispering in a foreign tongue. We realized then that the enemy had learned to hear us breathe. Back in Japan, naval engineers at Kure began disassembling the first captured sample. They quickly confirmed its purpose: a self-contained underwater microphone transmitting acoustic data by radio. But they could not replicate it. The circuitry depended on high-precision vacuum tubes, requiring glass and tungsten materials Japan no longer possessed. The copper windings alone exceeded what an entire factory could produce that late in the war. To the men who had served beneath the waves since Pearl Harbor, the revelation was devastating. The deep ocean had once been their refuge, their invisible battlefield. Now it had ears. Word spread quietly through submarine crews, warnings shared in mess halls, coded hints in patrol briefings. Avoid shallow water. Do not linger after surfacing. If strange tones are heard, dive immediately and change course. The fear was not of explosions or depth charges, but of something more terrifying: detection. For centuries, the sea had concealed its hunters. In 1944, that covenant was broken. The moment a Japanese crew pulled a sonobuoy from the Pacific, the Empire's submariners understood that the Americans were no longer fighting ships. They were mastering the very medium of sound. Soon, that mastery would expand into a full, coordinated weapon, a vast acoustic web stretching from carrier decks to destroyer escorts, trapping every submarine that dared to move. By late 1944, the Pacific had become a laboratory of sound. The U.S. Navy's Anti-Submarine Command, centered at Pearl Harbor in San Diego, coordinated an ocean-wide experiment that fused radar, radio, and acoustics into a single operational system. It was not one weapon, but a network, an invisible web that joined aircraft, ships, and technology into a single hunting organism. A typical hunter-killer group began with an escort carrier. Flat-topped ships like USS Bogue or USS Hoggett Bay, flanked by half a dozen destroyer escorts. Above them orbited aircraft fitted with radar scanners and racks of sonobuoys. Each patrol plane carried as many as 30 of the small cylinders in its bomb bay, packed beside 250-pound depth charges. Their job was no longer to search visually, but to listen. When a submarine's periscope or snorkel betrayed itself on radar, the aircraft swooped in low and seeded the sea with a string of buoys, each one activated on contact with salt water, its hydrophone dropping below the surface like a fishing line. The pings and hums of the ocean flowed upward through radio static into the headphones of a young radio man sitting in the belly of the plane. He would call out bearings, tone strongest, 270 degrees, and the pilot would circle, adding more buoys until a clear pattern formed. What emerged on their instruments was something new, a map of sound. Destroyers, listening through their own sonar, were guided toward the coordinates by radio. For the first time in naval history, detection from the air could be handed seamlessly to ships below. Once contact was confirmed, depth charges or hedgehog mortars followed, coordinated not by guesswork but by triangulated acoustic data. Vice Admiral Daniel V. Gallery, who later commanded Atlantic hunter-killer groups, described it succinctly. The aircraft found them, the buoys held them, the destroyers killed them. The system's efficiency was measurable. Before 1943, locating a submerged submarine was a statistical miracle, fewer than one kill for every 100 attacks. After sonobuoys entered mass service, that ratio inverted. By mid-1944, U.S. patrol aircraft in the Pacific reported confirmed submarine kills every 15 sorties. The silent ocean had become predictable, almost mathematical. The hardware evolved rapidly. Early AN CRT-1 buoys were succeeded by the CRT-4 with improved signal strength and automatic gain control that filtered out surface noise. Later versions could transmit for 6 hours using miniature thermionic tubes developed by RCA. Their radio frequencies were synchronized with airborne receivers built into the new AN/ARR3 sets, which allowed operators to monitor up to 6 buoys at once. The effect on submarine operations was catastrophic. Japanese I-boats, once capable of surfacing freely at night to recharge batteries, found the skies filled with unseen listeners. Even in darkness, aircraft could drop a pattern of buoys and listen for the whirring of propellers or the faint hiss of air bubbles escaping a ballast tank. To the American crews, it felt almost supernatural. Lieutenant Robert Gilmore of Patrol Bombing Squadron, VPB-142, recalled a mission near the Marianas. We dropped 6 buoys, spaced a mile apart. Within minutes, one of the channels came alive. Steady thump, 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 like a heartbeat. We knew it was a sub before we saw anything. The ocean talked to us. The integration of technology turned the Pacific into a networked battlefield long before the word existed. Radar scanned the sky and surface. Sonobuoys listened beneath. And the new magnetic anomaly detector, an electronic compass tuned to the faint distortions of metal hulls, confirmed final positions. All data flowed by radio back to fleet operations, where analysts plotted submarine movements in real time on acetate maps. By autumn, entire patrol sectors could be sealed off with sound. Task Force 57, operating east of the Philippines, deployed over 10,000 buoys in a single month. The cost of this acoustic curtain was minimal, less than 1% of the Navy's monthly ordnance budget. But the result was devastating. Japanese submarines began to disappear faster than they could be replaced. While the Japanese still relied on human senses, an ear pressed to a hydrophone cone, a navigator's intuition, the Americans had transformed perception itself into an industrial process. Every frequency, every echo, every noise became data. The statistics told the story with merciless precision. In 1942, U.S. Navy anti-submarine forces in the Pacific averaged 1 confirmed sink for every 1,000 flight hours. By 1945, that figure had improved tenfold. The once dreaded I-class boats, the pride of Japan's undersea fleet, had become liabilities. Their life expectancy after leaving port dropped below 2 weeks. American after-action reports, declassified decades later, read like the birth certificate of modern electronic warfare. A patrol aircraft sighted a wake or radar contact. It dropped sonobuoys in a grid pattern, triangulated the sound source, and called destroyers for the attack. Every movement, every explosion was logged in terms of coordinates, decibels, and signal strength. War had entered the era of instrumentation. To sailors on destroyer escorts like USS England, which famously sank 6 submarines in 12 days, the victory seemed almost effortless. Yet behind every successful kill lay thousands of invisible calculations. Radio frequencies modulated through vacuum tubes, bearing corrections derived from sound delay, signal amplification calibrated to the density of seawater. The Pacific, once a theater of heroic chance, had become an algorithm. Japanese commanders noticed the change but could not understand its mechanism. Reports described aircraft attacking even when visibility was 0, ships converging on submarines that had never surfaced, depth charges detonating with uncanny accuracy over positions the enemy could not possibly have known. In truth, the Americans were no longer searching. They were listening. By late 1944, sound had become the ultimate intelligence source. The ocean, vast and ancient, had been wired. And for Japan's submarine arm, every sortie now began with an unspoken dread, the knowledge that somewhere above, unseen and unheard, the enemy was already waiting to hear them move. The next revelation would come from within the submarines themselves. Crews who began to understand that bravery and stealth could not overcome physics, nor the silence of machines that now ruled the deep. In the final year of the war, Japan's submarine service lived two realities, one physical, the other psychological. The first was steel, diesel, and salt water. The second was silence, an oppressive awareness that somewhere above, machines were listening. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy still operated more than 120 submarines, from massive I-class cruisers to small coastal boats. Yet their tactics and equipment remained rooted in 1941. The doctrine that had guided early victories, night surface attacks using visual bearings and periscope rangefinding, was now obsolete. The same principles that once made the submarine invisible had become its death sentence. Inside these boats, life was a kind of confinement that defied imagination. The air was heavy with oil fumes, body heat, and carbon dioxide. Temperatures in the engine room reached 45 Bardux. Humidity condensed on bulkheads and dripped constantly, corroding tools and soaking bedding. When submerged for more than 12 hours, oxygen levels dropped so low that matches would not light. To these men, courage was no abstraction. It was the endurance of waiting while American aircraft circled overhead, dropping invisible ears into the water, waiting for depth charges that followed moments later, timed by patterns no human could predict. Submarine crews followed doctrines written before radar, before acoustic tracking, before the Americans had turned sound into mathematics. Their training still emphasized periscope reconnaissance, coordinated wolf-pack attacks, and reliance on surface night vision. These tactics had worked in the early war, when Japan's submarines had hunted warships near the Solomons and Java. But now, every time a periscope broke the surface, a radar set 50 kilometers away saw it instantly. Every time a propeller turned, a sonobuoy heard it. Petty Officer Tadao Ogura, a veteran of the I-176, described the transformation in his post-war diary. We were told to attack as before. Approach on the surface, fire torpedoes, escape underwater. But now the ocean glowed with radar and sang with sound. We could not move without being found. Even the sea itself had betrayed us. At training bases in Kure and Sasebo, instructors still drilled recruits in manual range estimation and compass plotting. There was little fuel for practice dives, and sonar training relied on recordings captured years earlier. Japan's most advanced hydrophone, the Type 93, used simple carbon microphones wired through amplifiers copied from pre-war German designs. Its effective detection range was rarely more than 1 km. The American sonobuoy could hear 8 times farther. For commanders like Lieutenant Commander Shinji Uchino of I-48, the problem was not bravery, but blindness. We fought deaf and mute, he later admitted during interrogation. We could not hear the enemy, and they could hear us everywhere. The contrast between technological age and tactical tradition became stark inside the cramped steel hulls. Submarines still carried paper charts, compasses, and mechanical range computers. Orders were delivered through speaking tubes. Communications with headquarters relied on low-frequency radio bursts that exposed their position to Allied direction-finding systems. Even the smallest mechanical noise became dangerous. Crews learned to stop speaking entirely when submerged. Wrenches were wrapped in rags, boots removed, tools tied down with cloth to keep them from rattling. Yet the ocean still betrayed them. Cavitation bubbles from worn propellers produced high-frequency echoes detectable by sonobuoys kilometers away. Captain Masamitsu Yanagi of the I-29 summarized the new reality in a final letter recovered after the war. The sea, once our friend, now belongs to them. We move unseen, but never unheard. The emotional collapse followed swiftly. Sailors spoke less, ate little, and wrote letters they would never send. They watched comrades vanish without a single distress call. Each departure from port carried the quiet understanding that few would return. When American hunter-killer groups closed in, depth charges reigned for hours, precise, rhythmic, unrelenting. Pressure waves smashed bulbs, burst pipes, and tore insulation from walls. In the dark, crewmen clutched rails as explosions crushed the hull like an iron drum. Those who survived surfaced into burning oil slicks and floating debris, realizing that death now came from science, not combat. Bravery had not diminished, but the ocean no longer rewarded it. The silent duels of 1942 had turned into extermination by instruments. By early 1945, Japanese submarines were being reassigned to cargo duty, ferrying rubber, fuel, and personnel to isolated garrisons. No longer hunters, they were couriers, ghosts of a fleet that once dreamed of strangling Allied supply lines. And yet, even as the Empire's undersea force faded into obsolescence, its engineers still clung to one last hope, that by studying the strange American cylinders hauled from the sea, they might uncover a secret that could restore their advantage. In October 1944, 2 months after the first acoustic cylinders had been recovered at sea, crates marked top secret to be examined under guard arrived at the Kure Naval Technical Department. Inside lay the captured sonobuoys, intact, astonishingly preserved and completely beyond Japan's industrial comprehension. The team assigned to analyze them included some of the Empire's best minds. Commander Takashi Matsuo, a radio engineer from Yokosuka Arsenal, Lieutenant Ichiro Kondo, a physicist who had studied under German scientists in Kiel, and a handful of exhausted technicians whose laboratories had been damaged by air raids. They began work in a basement shielded from reconnaissance aircraft, surrounded by shortages, no copper, no quality glass, and no replacement vacuum tubes. The first disassembly revealed an alien elegance. Each device was a perfect synthesis of acoustics and radio. The upper section held a compact transmitter, powered by a dry battery pack sealed in paraffin. Below that, a watertight chamber contained a small amplifier built around miniature vacuum tubes, barely the size of a finger. From the base extended a spool of thin wire, leading to a hydrophone assembly shaped like a metallic ear. The schematics, carefully traced by Lieutenant Kondo, showed design precision beyond Japanese production capacity. The copper windings were machine-wrapped to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. The vacuum tubes were made from ultra-clear glass and used heat-resistant filaments Japan could no longer manufacture. Even the solder was a specialized alloy, likely imported from America's copper surplus. When the device was powered in a saltwater tank, it came alive. A steady signal pulsed across the receiver spectrum, not continuous, but rhythmic, synchronized. When a wrench was dropped into the water, the sound translated instantly into sharp fluctuations on the oscilloscope. It was, in essence, a portable underwater ear, one that never tired, never misheard, and transmitted every vibration to the sky. Naval records later uncovered at Kure included a brief report from Commander Matsuo, dated November 12, 1944. The enemy's device functions as a sound collection and transmission apparatus. Range estimated several kilometers. Construction quality extremely high. Domestic replication not feasible given present shortages. This represents a decisive technical superiority. Tokyo Naval Arsenal attempted limited duplication using salvaged materials. The prototypes failed immediately. The vacuum tubes overheated. The batteries corroded within hours. The insulation, made from inferior rubber substitutes, dissolved in salt water. Without precision manufacturing, the Empire could not reproduce even the simplest element of the system. And so Japan's scientists turned from imitation to interpretation. They studied how the Americans might be using the buoys tactically, how they deployed them, how long they lasted, how far their signals reached. From scattered intelligence reports, a pattern emerged, aircraft dropping clusters of these devices, then attacking minutes later with uncanny accuracy. It was enough to confirm the horrifying truth. The Americans had not just built a listening device, they had built an acoustic network. In February 1945, a summary memorandum titled Enemy Acoustic Warfare Methods circulated through Imperial Navy Command. Its language was clinical, but its implications devastating. The enemy possesses means to detect submerged submarines by deploying radio-linked acoustic floats. These transmit data to aircraft and surface ships. Conventional stealth methods are ineffective. The ocean surface is no longer secure. The engineers at Kure were silent after that. The war had already moved beyond them. Tokyo burned nightly under B-29 raids. Electricity failed so often that experiments were conducted by candlelight. Every test, every reading, felt like archaeology, studying the relics of a civilization already lost. Lieutenant Kondo wrote in his private notes, later translated by historians, "We are dismantling the future. What we see inside these machines is a civilization that manufactures precision as effortlessly as we manufacture failure. Each part tells us not merely how we are losing, but why." The collapse of Japan's material base rendered even genius irrelevant. The copper required for a single sonobuoy equaled what was left in the National Reserve for 1 month of radio production. The chemicals needed for the battery cells had been cut off by blockade. Even the glass for the vacuum tubes could not be produced without imported quartz. All that remained was documentation. Drawings, notes, and photographs were locked in steel cabinets for post-war study. None would ever be used. By the time the last report reached Tokyo, the Empire's fleet was shattered, its shipyards burning, its submarines destroyed faster than they could be launched. In that final winter, the captured American buoys became less a source of fear than of fatal admiration, symbols of an industrial war Japan could never win. What began as a technical study had become an autopsy of an empire. The scientists at Kure would never hear the pings of their enemies' devices again, but the submariners at sea still could, faint, steady, inescapable. And for those men, the sound meant one thing: death was listening. By the start of 1945, the acoustic war was no longer a theory confined to laboratories or technical memos. It was a daily execution carried out in the Pacific's vast, indifferent silence. Japan's submarines, once feared for their range and precision, had become fugitives in their own element. The statistics told a truth no propaganda could conceal. Between January 1944 and the Empire's surrender, Japan lost more than 130 submarines, nearly two-thirds of its operational force. Of those, over 60% were destroyed by aircraft or surface ships guided by acoustic contact. The pattern was always the same: a radar sighting, a sonobuoy drop, a bearing transmission, and finally, the eruption of depth charges converging on coordinates invisible to the human eye. One of the first to fall victim to this new form of warfare was I-36, operating northeast of the Marianas. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Shinji Uchino, had reported hearing mechanical pulses in the water days before his final patrol, when the submarine was detected by a U.S. Navy PB-4Y2 privateer, On July 26, 1944, the American aircraft dropped a chain of 10 sonobuoys. The signals they sent back revealed the submarine's direction and speed. 2 hours later, destroyer escorts from Task Group 12.2 arrived and triangulated her position. The attack lasted 19 minutes. No wreckage surfaced. Another was I-48, sunk near the Bonin Islands. Survivors from nearby merchant convoys later recalled seeing aircraft circling for hours, dropping patterns of small buoys before the first depth charges detonated. Post-war U.S. Navy action reports described the operation with dispassionate precision. Contact obtained by sonobuoy array bearing 61 degrees. Target track confirmed by MAD, magnetic anomaly detector. 4 depth charge runs conducted. Oil and debris observed 15 minutes after final detonation. To the Japanese, these records read like death sentences written by machines. Even the smaller RO-class boats, which had once prowled near the Philippines, found themselves hunted with surgical efficiency. RO-110, sunk in February 1944, was the first confirmed Japanese submarine destroyed solely by aircraft-guided acoustic contact. RO-501, a German-built transfer submarine carrying strategic cargo, was detected and sunk in the Atlantic by a similar system. The oceans of 2 hemispheres had become linked by a single concept: sound as a weapon. For the crews, the effect was psychological annihilation. The sonobuoy's faint ping, barely audible, often misheard as distant thunder, became a sound of dread. Sailors began to imagine it even when it wasn't there. In one surviving diary from the I-366, a petty officer described nights of paranoia. "We heard nothing for hours, then a pulse, like a heartbeat. We froze. Every man stopped breathing. Then came another, nearer. The captain whispered, 'They have dropped their ears.' Minutes later, the bombs came. The fear went beyond the explosions. It was the sense that the ocean itself had betrayed them, that every vibration of the hull, every exhalation of air through the ballast vents, might call down fire from the sky. In the Pacific's final months, Japan's submarine arm disintegrated. Boats that once hunted convoys now carried drums of gasoline, barrels of rice, and crates of ammunition to starving garrisons in the Marianas and the Philippines. Their missions lasted longer but achieved nothing. Most never returned. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who oversaw the submarine force in 1945, later testified before Allied investigators, "We believed the ocean too vast to be controlled. We were wrong. The Americans had reduced the sea to numbers and equations. By mid-1945, U.S. hunter-killer groups no longer patrolled reactively. They hunted preemptively, sweeping entire sectors with grids of sonobuoys dropped every few kilometers. Destroyer escorts tracked contacts in formation, relaying data through radio networks linked to operation centers hundreds of kilometers away. It was not pursuit. It was extermination by calculation. When the war ended in August, fewer than 24 Japanese submarines remained afloat. Most were beached, surrendered, or scuttled in shallow water. None posed any threat. Their crews emerged pale, malnourished, and half-deaf from months of pressure and silence. They had lived inside steel coffins surrounded by an enemy they could not see, hunted by an intelligence they could not comprehend. For the survivors, the defeat carried a peculiar bitterness. They had not been outfought, only outheard. And when Japan's surrender came, the remaining submariners, those few still alive, would finally learn what had happened above them, how a network of floating machines had turned the Pacific from their sanctuary into their graveyard. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the survivors of Japan's submarine fleet surrendered with disbelief. They emerged from shattered ports, Kure, Sasebo, Yokosuka, to find their empire gone and their oceans no longer their own. In the weeks that followed, American naval intelligence teams arrived to examine the remains of what had once been the Imperial Navy's most secretive arm. The investigations began not with ships, but with documents. In dusty archives at Kure, they discovered files labeled Captured American Acoustic Device, Preliminary Study. Inside were sketches of the AN-CRT-1 sonobuoy and fragments of translated notes. The Americans reading them were astonished. The Japanese had grasped exactly what the device did, but their reports ended in resignation. Replication impossible with existing materials. At Yokosuka, engineers from the U.S. Navy's technical mission to Japan, known as JAP-NT-21, interviewed captured scientists who had analyzed the buoys. Commander Takashi Matsuo, the engineer who had written the final Kure report, admitted under questioning that the device's internal perfection had convinced him Japan could never win the technological war. It was not a weapon, he told his interrogators. It was civilization in miniature. What the Americans learned from these examinations was as revealing as what the Japanese had failed to understand. The sonobuoy was only one link in a chain that by 1945 stretched across the Pacific. From Honolulu to Guam, from the Marianas to the Aleutians, entire communication grids had been built to process acoustic data in real time. Naval air stations received signals from patrol aircraft, which in turn monitored hundreds of active buoys. Each tone, each echo, was converted into coordinates and plotted on regional maps, an embryonic version of what decades later would evolve into global undersea surveillance networks. In 1946, portions of this system were classified under a new name, Project Caesar, precursor to the Cold War's SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, an underwater array capable of detecting submarines across entire oceans. The lessons learned from fighting Japanese I-boats had become the foundation of post-war acoustic warfare. While the United States moved forward, Japan was forced to confront what it had missed. Allied occupation officers invited former naval engineers to tour American laboratories at Yokosuka and Atsugi, where shelves overflowed with precision instruments, oscillographs, and spare parts, materials that Japan had once tried and failed to replicate. Many of the visiting scientists wept openly. In a post-war memoir, Lieutenant Ichiro Kondo, who had dissected the first captured buoy, described the shock of visiting an American electronics depot in 1946. There were crates of vacuum tubes stacked higher than a man, glass clear and flawless. In our entire empire, we could not have produced even 1% of what I saw there. It was then that I understood. We had fought a war not of armies, but of factories. For Japan's naval community, the revelation was humiliating and liberating in equal measure. Engineers realized that they had been fighting against not a nation, but a scientific infrastructure, an entire ecosystem of research, industry, and education that had made American technological dominance inevitable. The American investigators shared some of these findings with Japanese officers in carefully curated briefings. They explained that each sonobuoy cost only about $20 to manufacture, less than the price of a single artillery shell. Factories in Chicago and New Jersey could produce 10,000 units a month, feeding a network so vast that any corner of the Pacific could be filled with ears within hours. To the former submarine captains sitting in those dim briefing rooms, the numbers were staggering. One report preserved in the U.S. Navy archives records the reaction of a Japanese officer. When we learned that the Americans had thousands of these devices and used them as freely as we used flares, we realized the war had been lost before we ever sailed. Post-war research teams in Tokyo University's engineering faculty studied the captured documentation, hoping to rebuild Japan's scientific foundations under Allied supervision. Many of the same engineers who once dismantled sonobuoys would later contribute to the nation's rebirth in electronics, radio communications, and eventually sonar, fields that would define Japan's post-war industry. But none forgot what those first buoys had meant. They were symbols of a transformation in warfare. Sound as surveillance, the ocean as data. In 1947, an American naval historian who had served in the Pacific summed up the shift in a single line. The Japanese believed the ocean would protect them. They never realized we had taught it to speak. For the submarine crews who returned home, that truth carried an unbearable weight. The ocean that had once been their ally had been converted into an instrument of their defeat. The empire had not been destroyed by ships or bombs alone. It had been undone by the invisible mathematics of sound, a language it had never learned to hear. In the war's final reckoning, Japan's defeat beneath the sea was not a story of courage lost, but of physics obeyed. Technology had rewritten the balance between man and ocean. The Empire's submariners had entered the war believing in stealth, endurance, and spirit. They ended it surrounded by machines that listened deeper than any human ear. The Pacific, once a frontier of freedom and mystery, had become measurable. Every wave carried echoes of engines. Every current transmitted the noise of existence. The Americans had not conquered the ocean with force. They had mapped it, reduced it to signals and coordinates. In that transformation lay a larger truth. The modern age no longer belonged to warriors who trusted instinct or weathered hardship. It belonged to those who could turn perception into data. To build a sonobuoy was to declare mastery over an element older than civilization itself. For the Japanese submariners who survived, the realization was both devastating and undeniable. They had fought bravely, navigating darkness and depth with the same discipline that once guided samurai across centuries. But courage could not equal circuitry. Dedication could not replace industry. The Empire had waged war with skill and faith. America had waged it with mathematics. One officer from the I-36, interrogated after the war, put it simply, "We lost not to men, but to measurement." He was not wrong. The sonobuoy's soft ping marked more than a submarine's position. It marked the beginning of a new era, where sound became surveillance and oceans became transparent. What once protected nations would now expose them. As the decades passed, that invisible technology expanded into global webs of hydrophones stretching across the Atlantic and Pacific, listening not for torpedoes, but for whispers of movement in the abyss. The ocean itself had been conscripted into war, yet somewhere beneath those networks lie the wrecks of the first to be heard, the silent hulks of Japan's lost submarines, their steel slowly dissolving into the deep. Around them the same currents still flow, the same quiet persists. The pings are gone now, replaced by the hum of modern sonar arrays. But the story remains preserved in water colder than memory. Every buoy dropped into the sea that year carried not just an ear, but a prophecy that in the future victory would belong to those who understood sound, not as music, but as mathematics. And so the ocean, once the last refuge of secrecy, became a mirror for humanity's noise. It reflects every hum of progress, every heartbeat of a machine. The Pacific sleeps above the wrecks of both hunter and hunted, keeping no allegiance, no judgment, only silence. But within that silence lingers a question, echoing through the depths where men once believed themselves unseen. When sound itself becomes a weapon, what ocean can ever again belong to men?